Okay, welcome to Lecture 1, What is Religion? And this is Part 1, so there will be two parts to this lecture. Today, we're really just going to kind of broach the topic of religion. We're not going to get bogged down in too many of the details or the specifics. We're just going to talk about what traditions we're going to cover in this class. We're going to give some relative scale to them. We'll talk about how large some of these traditions are by population. We'll look at some dates when some of these traditions are thought to have started, but we're also going to problematize these. So we don't have specific dates for all of these traditions. Sometimes we have a specific date of, say, the birth or revelation of a founder, which is wonderful. It gives us a starting point, but we shouldn't confuse that with the beginning of the tradition itself. Sometimes the tradition doesn't really get going, or some of the theological developments don't occur until later in history. But again, we're not going to get too worried about all these details and problems. We're going to kind of just talk more generally today. I promise you, you will have plenty of detail in the coming lectures. But today we're just going to kind of get a sense of what we're getting into this semester. One thing I want to note, and I think this is an important thing to pay attention to. You won't be tested on it per se, but my goal for the class is not for you to just learn a bunch of dates and names and histories. You will have to do that for sure. They're necessary for understanding these traditions that we'll be discussing for the next period of time here. But beyond that, I'm hoping you get something deeper out of this course. So the way I often talk about it is in two stages. In the first stage, I'm hoping everyone in this class can achieve this first stage, and that is to make what is strange more familiar. So we're making the strange familiar. What do I mean by that? We're going to incorporate or explore a variety of traditions, languages, terminologies, histories, rituals, ways of dress that are just strange to us. By strange, I don't mean in a negative way. I just mean unfamiliar. So we're not familiar with many of these traditions. At least most of us in this class are probably not familiar with all of the traditions that we're going to be discussing and kind of delving into. Our goal is to make them more familiar. So each of these traditions, you're going to leave this class with more familiarity, and by virtue of that, they'll be less strange or less odd or different to you. So when you see a Muslim or a Hindu or a Buddhist, or you meet one in your bio lab or the next job that you get, you won't have as many questions, and it won't seem as strange of a way of life to you. They'll become more familiar. So that's kind of the basic goal of this course, right? We're taking in information from others, and we're making ourselves become more familiar with it. Stage 2, where I'm hoping some of you get, perhaps not all of us, but this would be kind of the higher aim or goal of this course from my perspective, is to do the inverse of making the strange familiar. That is to say, can we make the familiar become more strange? So we should begin to think about what is familiar to us. Maybe you're born into a middle-class family. Maybe you're Christian, and maybe you're from Southern California. An example. Of course, not all of you fit into this category. Maybe few of you do. But take whatever is familiar to you. I want this course to demonstrate that that is actually strange to the rest of the world. So to be one thing, your identity, say Christian, middle-class, Southern Californian, is not the expectation for everyone. It is not the norm for everyone. It is a product of a particular history, a particular place, a particular set of views with certain goals and aims in mind, and that we're going to then subject our own perspective, be it the Christian or Muslim or whatever your identity is, subject that to the rest of the world's traditions. You'll see that perhaps your tradition is a minority tradition, and not everyone in the world believes in the same assumptions that your religion asserts, for example. So, in general, overview of the course, let's make the strange familiar. Let's become more familiar with things that are now strange to us, that we don't fully understand. And then also let's make what we take for granted, what we assume about ourselves and perhaps assume about the rest of the world, let's make that more strange. Let's realize that we come from a particular history and place. Okay, so let's look just for a second here at a handful of the traditions that we'll be spending more time, more focused attention on for this semester. We're also going to take a look at a tradition called Zoroastrianism. You'll learn a lot more about Zoroastrianism. Don't be worried if you've never even heard of this religion. My assumption is that most of you have never heard of Zoroastrianism, or maybe you've heard it in passing but have no idea what it's about. Are there still Zoroastrians today? If so, how many? These are questions that we'll answer in much more detail throughout the semester. What I would like you to know for now is Zoroastrianism is thought to be the first monotheistic religion in the world. What do I mean by monotheistic? The first tradition that looks and worships one God. Monotheism breaks down to one God or God. So Zoroastrianism, we're going to see, is extremely influential, directly influential to the traditions of Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and even Hinduism, which then influences and gives birth to Buddhism. So the 5 major world traditions that we're focusing in on this class, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, and Buddhism, all find some root or some influence comes from this ancient tradition of Zoroastrianism, which thrived in what is present-day Iran or Iran. And Zoroastrians still exist today. They live mostly in northwest India, parts of rural Iran, and in the United States. We have Zoroastrians, actually a quite vibrant Zoroastrian community in the Los Angeles area. We also have some in New York and other places throughout the world. However, when we look at the large, grand scale of all human beings, of all traditions, they, like our Native American friends, make up a very small fraction of the world's population. Best estimate is there are about 200,000 Zoroastrians alive and practicing their religion today. So a fraction of a percent. In addition to Zoroastrianism, during this lecture I'll give on Zoroastrianism, actually in a couple lectures from now, we're going to also look at ancient Mesopotamia. So generally the same part of the world. We're going to be looking more at modern-day Iraq, between the Tigris and Euphrates River. We're going to look at some of these ancient civilizations that gave birth to many of the assumptions that we now take for granted when it comes to religion, like sky gods and human ethical codes in relation to these gods, and so on and so forth. The next tradition we'll look at, after completing our section on Zoroastrianism and ancient Mesopotamia, will be Judaism. So Judaism is probably a religion that most of us are familiar with. Most of us have a Jewish friend, or maybe many of us in this class are Jewish ourselves. It's one of the, again, earlier monotheistic traditions. It is the first of these Abrahamic traditions. The Abrahamic traditions are Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. These 3 are united in many ways we're going to talk about in much detail, but they're all united in the same prophet, Abraham, or Ibrahim, who the Muslims refer to him as. So Judaism, we're going to date possibly as early as 1000 BCE, 1,000 years before the Common Era or before Christ existed. However, to date it this early is somewhat problematic because at this time, 1000 BCE, all the way through basically the start of the Common Era, for that 1,000-year period, we don't really get Judaism, we get ancient Canaanite or ancient Israelite religion. So we're going to kind of parse these differences out and talk about this tradition in 2 distinct phases: ancient Israelite or Canaanite religion, and then rabbinic Judaism. We're also then going to break many of these traditions down into their denominational differences. So we're going to talk about Reform Judaism, Conservative, Orthodox, even Hasidic Judaism. Much like, actually, the previous two traditions that I already introduced here, Judaism is a relatively small religion. Most people think of it as a big religion because we see Jewish characters or people in the media, in Hollywood, in the news. We talk about Jerusalem and Israel as kind of modern world, of modern world importance. However, when it comes to how many Jews are alive and practicing today, it's relatively small. It's a fraction of 1%, again, of the world's population. Best estimate is about 14 million Jews are alive today. 14 million compared to, say, when we get to Hinduism, there are over 1 billion Hindus in the world. There's over 375 million Buddhists in the world. So there are not many Jews practicing and alive today. However, it is still a tradition of quite a bit of weight and influence in the modern world, especially in America. The next tradition we'll look at is the tradition I'm assuming most of you are most familiar with. So Christianity. Here we have the depiction of the Last Supper with Christ, the Savior, the supposed Son of God, right here in the center. Now, Christianity, we're going to have more accurate dates assigned to Christianity, though we'll problematize them a little bit once we get into the details. But right around the Common Era, between 6 and 4 BCE, is when Jesus of Nazareth is born. He dies around 30 CE at the age of 30, 33, somewhere in that range. We're going to talk about Christianity, though, as if you don't know anything about it. Many of you will come into this class not being Christian yourself and not having any familiarity with this tradition outside of, say, popular language or popular presentations of the tradition, which are sometimes erroneous, sometimes very problematic. So we're going to start at the basics. I should warn you now, people tend to do worse on the exams on their own tradition. What I mean by that is if you're a Christian, you're probably not going to do very well on the exam when it comes to our section on Christianity. If you're Jewish, you're probably not going to do very well on our section on Judaism. Buddhists, for some reason in my course, always do really poorly on the section on Buddhism. And I have a theory here. My theory is you rest on your laurels. You think you know this tradition historically, sociologically, anthropologically, because you were born into it and you've come out of it. So you just don't read or you don't listen as closely to the lectures. I'm warning you now because I don't want you to do that. I want you to treat your own tradition as if you knew nothing about it. Come with your own expertise, of course, and I would love to see your comments in our discussion board. However, pay attention to the details. Don't take anything for granted. You can question much of what we bring up or what we read in this class. That's encouraged, but don't just assume that you know this tradition well. And I'm speaking on this in the section on Christianity, of course, but this goes to all of your respective traditions. We're going to talk about different dates, of course, as I started talking about the birth of Christ, the crucifixion of Christ. But these are actually not as important as later dates, mostly in the 4th century CE, 300 years after the time of Jesus. We see a major shift in the tradition. It goes from being a minority persecuted tradition to the religion of the Roman Empire. And we're going to talk a lot about that period of time and what this does to the tradition of Christianity itself. Now, unlike the traditions we've talked about up until this point, Christianity is a large tradition. It is a world tradition in every sense of the word. It is, if you take all of their denominations together, Catholicism, Protestantism, Eastern Orthodox Christianity, if you take them all and you put them in one big pile, Christianity is, without a doubt, the largest tradition in the world, the most populous tradition in the world, coming in at about 2.1, 2.2 billion people. It's over 30% of the world is Christian in some way, Catholic, Protestant, evangelical, non-denominational, whatever that might be. Okay, we're going to move from Christianity to the third and last of the Abrahamic traditions, or what we sometimes refer to as the Western traditions, and that is the religion of Islam. Now, many of us in this class are Muslim. Some of us are Muslim. Many of us are not Muslim, and don't actually know much about the tradition at all. So this is actually perhaps my favorite religion to teach. I like teaching Islam and Buddhism perhaps the most. Islam because a major aspect or major portion of my job is to clear up a lot of the misconceptions or stereotypes that exist or surround this tradition of Islam. We're going to start with the Prophet Muhammad, this new revelation that he has that is eventually written down. It's recited and written down called the Quran. We're going to look at some sections of the Quran. What does it actually say? As opposed to what have you heard someone on the news say it says? We're going to clear up a lot of those misconceptions. Islam is the second largest religion. Again, multiple denominations. We have different types of Muslims all throughout the world. The major two traditions being Sunni and Shia Islam. We're going to talk about how these two traditions diverge, what they have in common, what are the differences theologically and politically about these two groups. But if you take all of Islam, pile it up in one big group, and we count them up, there's about 1.5 billion Muslims in the world, making it the second largest tradition at around 23 to 25% of the world's population. It starts in the 6th century, so the Prophet Muhammad, we'll learn, was born in 570 CE. And really the tradition doesn't start until the 7th century, after his initial revelations in 610, and then the kind of following spread of Islam that occurs during his life and after his death. I'm throwing a lot of numbers out at you guys right now. If you're kind of pausing this and writing them down, wonderful. I want you to get a sense of these traditions in scale and relative scale. But I'm going to go over all of these numbers again. So any date, any population number that I've thrown out, we'll be going over in more detail when we talk about each tradition during that section. So don't get too wrapped up in it. I won't test you on this first round when it comes to certain numbers, but I might ask you a question like, what is the largest tradition? Or I might say something like, true or false, Judaism is the second largest tradition in the world. You would very clearly mark that down as false after I just told you there are less than 1% of the world's population. Okay, so we're going to move away after Islam and we're going to talk about some other traditions from the quote-unquote East. We're also going to talk about this East and West divide and how maybe that's a problematic way to divide up these religions or religious traditions. But the first one, when we move to the East, that we'll talk about is Hinduism. Now, Hinduism, I just mentioned, a large tradition. Over 1 billion people are alive and well and practicing various forms of Hinduism. That's about 15% of the world's population. When do we date Hinduism? I often get people who know that I teach world religions, that I'm interested in the category of religion and the history of religions, and they often come up and tell me they want to show off their knowledge, of course, right? And I often get people who say, oh yeah, Hinduism is the world's oldest religion, world's oldest living religion. And in a sense, they're right. We have these settlements that exist in the Indus Valley. We call it the Vedic period, that focus on some of this core beliefs and gods of modern Hinduism that existed around 4000 BCE, 6,000 years ago. However, they're not correct in the sense that the religion that is practiced in 4000 BCE, in 2000 BCE, actually also in 500 CE, so after the birth of Christ, after Judaism is fully thriving as a religion, is still not anything like modern Hinduism. So our modern form of Hinduism doesn't develop until much later. We're going to break that down into a timeline and look at it in more detail. But Hinduism is, in a sense, it has its roots in a very ancient practice. But modern Hinduism is nothing like that ancient Vedic practice. So we're going to try to distinguish between those two forms of Hinduism. We'll then move on to our final tradition. We're going to end this semester with Buddhism. Buddhism is a tradition that is formed out of Hinduism. We'll learn that Siddhartha Gautama, who is the Buddha himself, was a Hindu, born and raised a Hindu, into Hindu culture, Hindu expectations about how he should live his life, what kind of duties are ascribed to him, and that he breaks a lot of these requirements or expectations and creates a new following, a new way of life, a new way to see the world, a new way to understand the nature of suffering and what we as human beings can do in response to suffering. Buddhism is a large, vibrant tradition with many denominations. It, though, is not as large as, say, Hinduism or Islam or Christianity, which all boast numbers of over 1 billion adherents. Buddhists tend to be somewhere in the 300 to 500 million range. The most accurate estimation might be 375 million people in the world identify as Buddhist. That's about 5%, 7% of the world's population. We're also going to be going over two other Indian religions, or religions born out of India, alongside Hinduism and Buddhism. One of those is Sikhism, which I won't say too much about right now. We'll spend actually less amount of time on these next two traditions than the traditions I've already discussed. But Sikhism is a religion that is born actually much later in history. So it starts around the 15th century, and it is influenced by a lot of the prevalent religious culture at the time, which is namely Hinduism and Islam. Now, it would be wrong to say that Sikhism is a combination of these two traditions. It's just frankly not. But it does take on some influence from these other traditions. It is more monotheistic than Hinduism, but it also, as you'll see, has a lot of Hindu influence with reincarnation and karma and so on and so forth. So we'll talk about that at more length when we get to that section. The last Indian tradition that we're going to talk about is Jainism. Now, Jainism is a tradition that is known probably most for its commitment to ahimsa. Now, ahimsa means nonviolence, and we're going to talk about this in much more detail, but you'll notice here the wearing of the covering over the mouth and these brooms that they're covering with them. These are ways in which they try to achieve the greatest amount of nonviolence, or the least amount of violence as they possibly can. So I was asked in another class, are they all women? No, just this photo is of Jain women, but men and women both practice Jainism. And, excuse me, you'll see the brooms, they're used to brush their path in front of them so that they do not step on anything inadvertently and accidentally kill an insect or some other kind of living creature. The covering over the mouth is so they don't take in any microorganisms or insects, and your body's immune system will naturally kill these other organisms. So there's this real effort to demonstrate that there is this understanding that they are a part of the world and inextricably linked, intertwined with the rest of the world. And to commit violence on something else, inadvertent or not, is to commit violence on oneself, this entire community. So a really kind of wonderful position, I think, very admirable. And we'll go ahead and kind of talk through this position in a lot more detail, and the entire tradition, not just the position of ahimsa. And then the last two traditions that we'll talk about are both ancient Chinese traditions, and each kind of bend toward the philosophical orientation rather than a traditional religious perspective. But it's not my job to draw the line between religion and philosophy. It's just to, I'll leave that up to you. I guess I'll say that much for now. The first will be Daoism. So we're going to look at the writings of Lao Tzu, ancient philosopher who wrote the Tao Te Ching, kind of presenting a radically different way in which one can see the world, and one that I appreciate in many ways, and I also think is quite admirable. So we'll spend a little time looking at that. And then lastly, we'll look at the ancient philosopher Confucius, who comes to us between the 6th and 5th century BCE, and doesn't just set up a new philosophy, but a new code of ethics, and one that is during a time of great kind of civilizational pursuit as well. So many will say that Confucianism is more of a philosophy than a religion. But again, to draw that line is difficult, if not impossible, to do consistently. So we'll go ahead and explore the beliefs and some practices and rituals that come along with the Confucius way of thought, and leave that question of religion or philosophy to each and every one of you, or for perhaps another day. I've come across this interesting timeline, and I I thought about not including this timeline. It's highly problematic in lots of different ways. The academic or scholarly side of me really wants to kind of break down all these categories and show you all the errors in the ways that this timeline is constructed. However, I also think it's kind of helpful. So I included it. I will not test you on this timeline by any means, but I want to just give you a sense of how and where these traditions develop from, what is their relationship to each other, so on and so forth. We can see, for example, that Judaism, they have it dated to 900 BC. I said 1000 BCE. These dates are contentious. We can discuss the reasons why we date them differently. I would actually date Judaism not at either of those dates, but as late as 70 CE, so 1,000 years later. And we're going to talk about why that's the case when we discuss Judaism. So I don't want you to get too wrapped up in the traditions, dates, or relationship, but you can see a relative scale here. So we can see, for example, that Christianity comes as a development out of Judaism, and that Islam comes as a development out of Christianity as well. We can see, for example, if we look at the Indic or Indian traditions, that ancient Vedic period that I was talking about exists all the way down to about 4000 BCE or 3500 BCE. And then we get Hinduism as a birth from this ancient Vedic tradition. Here we have Buddhism, but for some reason this timeline doesn't show the direct relationship between Hinduism and Buddhism. As you can see in the legend here, this dotted line is supposed to say influenced by another religion. Well, the Buddha himself was a Hindu, and I don't know why there is no dotted line here. So again, this map is a little problematic, or this timeline, but you can get a sense of how late some of these develop when compared to others. The other chart I wanted to show you is just this very reductionist, very, very basic pie chart of world religions by population. Again, we can contest a lot of this criteria. How do they come up with these numbers? Who is considered a Hindu? Who's considered a Christian? What kind of surveys are being done to gather this information? But again, it's also a little helpful to see here that Christians are about 30 to 35% of the world's population. Muslims come in, second place, about 20%. And that we kind of work our way down the line. These are the four largest traditions: Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, and Buddhism. But also note that there's a spike in the non-religious sector of world belief or world tradition. So more and more people every year are identifying as either non-religious, atheist, or agnostic. And this is quickly becoming one of the larger categories. Now, it's also funny that they have decided to just write other religions in this 12.4%. That'll include everything like Jainism, Judaism, Zoroastrianism, many of the traditions that we'll reference or speak about in great detail in this class. And it's a little problematic to me that they don't even receive a title or a name of their own, but rather they are just disregarded as other. We're going to talk about this way of categorizing in a lot more detail during this semester. Okay, sorry. Like I said in the last lecture, I like to check the time to make sure that I am still recording. So that's going to happen pretty much every lecture. You'll just have to bear with me there. The next thing I want to talk about, and this is important, again, just getting into the expectations or setting the expectations for this course as opposed to perhaps other exposure you've had to the topic of religion or world religions. There will be, I should warn you, a couple questions in the exam, as well as the first quiz that might be pulled from the next couple slides here. I want to talk briefly just about the difference in disciplines between religious studies and theology. So religious studies is what we're doing in this class, right? This is a religious studies course at a secular state university, school, a secular public school. That's different from theology. So I don't want one to come in here expecting a church session or a Sunday school session on religion when the expectations of religious studies are just very different. So I'm going to say a few words about the differences here. The first, what is theology? So, in its very basic sense, theology is the study of the nature of God, or the nature of transcendence, the divine, a deity, whatever we call God, or gods, or these deities. Theology is an attempt to understand the nature of that. So it assumes that God exists, and our goal is to understand what is the nature of God. How does God work? What does God want from us? What are the expectations? What happens after we die? So on and so forth. Religious studies is not that. Back to theology. Theology usually happens within a tradition. So it contains a set of assumptions. There's Jewish theology, there's Christian theology, there's Islamic theology. There's Hindu theology. Now, within each tradition, there are subdivisions as well. So if you're a Christian, you might look to Catholic theology if you're a Catholic Christian. If you're a non-denominationalist, you might look to a different set of theological assumptions. If you're a Calvinist, you look to John Calvin's writings and those that follow this tradition. So the idea is they each work with a set of assumptions in order to try to understand truth with a capital T. The truth about the beginning of the world, the truth about what happens after we die, the truth about what you should do as a follower of that tradition and as a believer in that God or those gods. Now, religious studies, none of those things, right? I can see how these two fields would be confused. Often I tell people I'm a professor of religious studies, and they say, oh, great, so are you a minister as well, or are you a pastor as well? And I often find myself having to clarify the differences between these two traditions or these two approaches or disciplines, because we tend to think of religion in this general sense. Religion occupies this sense of personal matters, of faith, of God, of church and worship. But religion is also a thing to study, right? There are religious traditions around the world. Religion motivates people's political aspirations and actions. Religion involves sociology, history, anthropology, all of these other aspects. So we in this class want to make sure that we're not assuming theology. Instead, we're really kind of wrapping our head around the discipline that we're engaging in, which is the academic or secular study of religion. Now, this word here, it's underlined. It's underlined for a reason. I want you to know this word. You will, I guarantee you, be tested on this word at some point. This is not to say that everything you'll be tested on is underlined. You can't just look for the underlined words, but every once in a while, I'll kind of demonstrate there's some extra importance attached to this concept or term. This one, Religionswissenschaft, is a German word that comes out of the 19th century that really just means the science of religion or the secular study of religion. So what do we mean by this? What do we mean by the science of religion? There's an attempt in the 19th century to try to understand religion as opposed to God. So God and religion are disassociated in a sense. Remember, the job of theology is to understand God, or whatever we call God. The job of religious studies is not to understand God, it is to understand religion, this category of religion. What is religion, right? That's the question of this lecture here, of this chapter that we're reading. So in the 19th century, we get a guy named Max Mueller. Let's see if I wrote his name down. I don't think I did. Okay. You don't need to know his name, but his name's Max Mueller. And he is attempting to study this cultural phenomenon, this thing called religion that is assumed to exist all throughout the world, right? We explore India and we see a different kind of religion. We explore the Amazon and we see different native religions being practiced. We go to the Middle East and we see another religion. All these religions exist, and Max Mueller thinks it's appropriate to study these religions. This gives birth to the social scientific study of religion, or what we now call religious studies. So, Religionswissenschaft is not theology. Religionswissenschaft is kind of the birth of this secular academic study of religion. It sees religion as this cultural phenomenon, right? There are religious behaviors, beliefs, traditions, practices, codes of ethics, ways of dress, so on and so forth. It seems worth our time to try to understand these things because, as I just said, it affects how people live, what their priorities are, what their assumptions are about other people in the world, including themselves as their own people or community. Religious studies does not seek to understand truth. Its aim is to be neutral. Its aim is to be descriptive and as objective as possible. So, my goal in this class is not to tell you in the end that Zoroastrianism is the one true religion that you all must convert in order to enter paradise in the end. My goal here is to tell you what other people believe in each of these traditions. If you're curious about me personally, I'm not religious, so I'm not coming at this with a particular religious bias. Rather, I'm here to simply try to demonstrate with as much accuracy and neutrality as possible what each of these traditions say about themselves, with as much complexity and detail as I possibly can. How do we go about doing that in our field? We look to the disciplines of sociology, history, anthropology. We can look to psychology. We can look to, all sorts of disciplines that are related to the general category of religion. So, if we go back over here into the section on theology, a sample question, if you're a theologian or you're engaging in theology, you might ask a question, and this is a good question to ask in the field or discipline of theology: how is God revealed in the Bible? And then what would you do? You would likely get together with others who assume a few things, that God exists. They assume that the Bible is the Word of God, or is at least inspired by God. And then you go through and you read this sacred scripture or this text, and you try to understand how God is revealed through this text. In religious studies, we don't ask that question. It's a question that we don't think we can answer because we're not working with the same set of assumptions as a group of believers in that tradition are working with. Rather, we might ask a question like, who wrote the Bible? How do we figure that answer out? We look to a set of histories. We look to different pieces of literature, comparative literature. We do literary analysis. We look to archaeology and certain findings that were able to corroborate many of these events. So we're just asking different types of questions. Again, on the right-hand side, what we are doing here, our aim is always to be neutral, to try to understand history in its kind of purest sense. On this side, it's not a better or worse claim, it's just different. The goal is to try to understand truth with a capital T. In religious studies, we will not ask the questions like, does God exist? Who is God? You could take a philosophy of religion course and ask questions like that, and we can work through the logical structures of such questions. But in religious studies, that's not so much our aim. So, again, I've mentioned this a few times. We can just list it in a bit more of a fuller form here. Each discipline uses a different set of criteria. In theology, you might look to the authority of Scripture. Your sacred text, your Bible, your Quran, your Hebrew Bible, they might be seen as authoritative. If it's written here, it is assumed to be authoritative or true. You might look to a leader in your tradition. You might look to a pope or your imam. You might look to certain councils, church councils, who have thought about this, who have kind of special, privileged authority to make certain judgments. Or you might look to a set of prophets. You might look to what Abraham said. You might look to what Moses said, or Mary, or other people who are thought to be prophets. In religious studies, of course, we don't take this as legitimate authority. We look to things like archaeology, textual criticism, scientific method, history, psychology, philosophy, anthropology, sociology. We look to all of these other disciplines that are assumed to have more authority in our secular institutions, and not just assumed to have more authority, but do have more authority in what our goal is. If your goal or your aim is neutrality, to be an observer, to be descriptive in your work, then yes, we must look to these fields and not the fields of theology. So from time to time, if in our discussion boards, our conversations tend towards certain theological assumptions, I might attempt to draw you back and bring you back into the world of religious studies. Now, why is this important? Why do I care about making this distinction in this class? Again, I've mentioned this. This class is not about defending or attacking personal religious beliefs. I could care less if you're Christian or Jewish or Muslim. I think each can be a wonderful thing and each can be a harmful thing. My goal is to try to give an accurate, objective description of each of these traditions with as much complexity as a course like world religion allows me. So it's not about defending or attacking beliefs. Also, we cannot just ignore historical scientific findings, right? So if something that is presented in this class is corroborated by archaeology and history and sociology and anthropology, your job is not to say, that's not what my tradition teaches, so I'm ignoring that. Your job is to incorporate new information into your whole framework of education and make sense of how everything fits together. Why do I even have to say this? It's my fear and it's my experience, not often, but it's happened, that this class might seem threatening to your religious beliefs. I've had students approach me and say, what you just taught me is not what my tradition taught me, and do I just need to stop believing in God and throw out my entire tradition? My answer is always no. That is not the goal of this class. My goal for you is for you to come out a more educated, responsible thinker, educated in the content of religious studies and world religions in particular, and that you're able to kind of take all of this in and become a more responsible thinker throughout. So this is and has been for most of my students an opportunity for them to strengthen their faith. For example, if your faith rests on the notion that the world was created 6,000 years ago, that's a pretty weak and flimsy faith because it can be easily disrupted by much of our geological, scientific understanding of the world. So that's not to say that Christianity is wrong when it asserts, or that Christianity is wrong as a tradition. It's only to say that those Christians who assert that the world is 6,000 years are clearly wrong, but that does not mean Christianity itself is wrong. Again, our job here is not to call into question any tradition or faith, but is to show the history and sociological and ritual-driven aspects of each tradition. Okay, so if you have questions on that, I'm happy to take more questions and start even a discussion on the discussion board if anyone would like to kind of more fully flesh out that discussion there. Okay, lastly, this is going to be the last slide for today's lecture. We'll do part 2 next time. I want you to think for a second about these two words, religious and secular. Because much of what we're going to be doing this semester is seeking to understand the religious studies, right? Studying the religious. And I don't think it would be very responsible of us to do so before having had done some kind of exercise in trying to determine what we come into this class assuming about the religious and the secular. So, what I'm going to ask you in a minute here to actually pause this e-lecture for about 5 minutes. You can set a little timer for yourself and spend 5 minutes on another piece of paper. You can do it on a Word document on your computer if you'd like. You don't need to turn this in, but I'd like you to do this for your own sake. I want you to write down a list of things, ideas, concepts, words, traditions, actions that you associate with each of these categories. So, under religious, for example, you might write something like God. God is clearly on the side of religious. On the secular, you might write something down like the nation state or government, something that seems on its face, at least, very secular, very non-religious. Now, these don't need to be perfect. Someone can make the argument, our government is incredibly religious. It has rituals and it has its forms of worship, like the Pledge of Allegiance, and so on and so forth. And that's fine. I'm happy to disrupt this list after we create it, but I want you to at least spend 5 minutes compiling this list. Write down at least 6 things on each side of the list that you associate. So go ahead and pause the lecture now, and then you can start it in a second here. Okay, so I'm hoping you've each created a list at this point. And I just want to bring up when I've done this in the past. I've written down the list that my students have created, and I'm wondering if it at all is familiar to you, or if it looks like your list, if you can compare them. On the side of the religious, often I get answers, and these aren't right or wrong. They're just telling, and we're going to talk about why in a second here. I get answers like God, or the one I put up there. Supernatural, this is under the religious heading, of course. Spiritual, scripture or Bible, I often get. Ritual, prayer, heaven, hell, afterlife, a prophet or founder. Contemplative, so someone who's thinking, contemplating the world, his or her place in it. Private, irrational, and violence. This is a very common list that I get. See how many of these are actually on your list. Are there 2 or 3 maybe? Under secular, I think this will vary much more, but I get things like the state, the nation state, economics, law, medicine. Public is thought to be secular. Private is thought to be religious. The profane, football, someone said, is secular, it's not religious. Now, my point here, the reason I have us do this list, is to see what we assume in these categories, but also to ask yourself a set of questions. When we define the religious, so the next lecture we're going to do is going to be focused on definitions. Who defines the religious, and how is it defined differently? We should always be asking ourselves, who is doing the defining? What is at stake in the definition? Why does it matter? Who benefits from this definition? Who is marginalized by this definition, or who's disadvantaged by such definitions? And what we'll come to find, the list I just showed you, and perhaps, I can't assume too much because I'm not seeing your list in front of me, but perhaps your list also assumes a certain predominant Protestant set of assumptions. So, what I mean by this, and we're going to look at the history of the definition of religion, how the term came to be. We're going to discover that the term religion is a primarily Christian term. It comes out of basically the Enlightenment era of Christianity in Europe, and that it sets down a whole host of norms. So, what do I mean by this? What do we assume religion to be? We assume religion to have a founder, hint, hint, someone like Jesus Christ. We assume it to have a church-like place, so your cathedral or your church or your mosque or your synagogue. We assume it to have certain scriptures, certain written texts, like your Bible. We assume it to have a community of people. We assume it to have some kind of afterlife. All of these assumptions are specifically Judeo-Christian, mostly Christian, and we'll talk about that in much more detail as the semester unfolds. But the idea here is, when we then go look to other quote-unquote religions, when we discover Buddhism in Northeast India or Southeast Asia, when we discover Hinduism, when we discover certain Native American traditions or indigenous traditions in the Amazon in South America, we go in with a certain lens. We go in assuming that every religion around the world is going to have some kind of text, some kind of founder, some kind of belief in the afterlife, some kind of code of ethics, and so on and so forth. When really, what happened was we had Protestants in the Enlightenment era use their assumptions and project those assumptions onto the rest of the world that they were then discovering at the time. So we need to be cautious about how we deploy this term, how we use it to describe others who might not fit so easily into this category of the religious. We're also going to talk at more length towards the end of the semester about this concept of the secular as well. What is the secular? How do we define the secular? Though we'll spend less time on that, we'll fill it out a little bit more. So, at this point, I think we'll finish up today's lecture, part 1 of What is Religion. Next lecture, part 2 of What is Religion. Again, we're going to look at much more detail about the history of the term religion. We're going to look at various definitions of the term religion, and then we're going to look at typologies. So things like atheism, polytheism, monotheism, henotheism, so on and so forth. You're going to work on these definitions and make sure that you can differentiate these different categories of religion that we use to describe various religious traditions around the world. For now, that's all. If you have any questions, please post them to the discussion board. Thanks.